Hello, my HS243/348 history students, Civil War Reconstruction students. This is your Professor Donald Earl Collins. I'm talking to you today regarding both the assignment that you just finished and that long process of doing first and second drafts around it, and talk to you about the freestyle artifact project that you're going to be doing for the remainder of the semester. First of all, I'm mostly pleased. I wasn't joking with last week when I said I was mostly pleased with your work, even though most of you look shocked I would be pleased with anything. But in point of fact, I am. Even, so pleased I didn't do a curve for either section of the course because that's how many, half the, if you take into account all the grading, and everything else, that more than half the students in the class had a grade of basically a B plus, meaning an 87, 86 and a half or so or higher, somewhere near B plus or higher. That was at least half. Two-thirds of you had a grade probably of about 83 or higher. So maybe more than, that's more than two-thirds. Probably 80% of you had that much, right? So overall, I'm really pleased you actually understood what, for the most part, what I was asking. And some of you managed to take something that didn't even look like a rough draft, forget about first draft, and turn it into a workable first, the equivalent of a workable first draft, or even a pretty decent second draft. So I'm happy about the work overall. There are a few more things I'm going to show you in class in terms of, the kinds of things that you could have brought up in your, in terms of the kinds of questions you could have asked. The number one problem that people had, of course, there were two issues. One was the fact that so many of you still try to answer the question. It's like, if I'd been standing there and then someone put a bag over my face, plastic bag, and slowly suffocated me for 5 or 10 minutes, you probably just stood there and watched the whole thing. That's how much I've talked about this, and yet you still did what you wanted to do anyway, which was just answer the question. And some people are like, well, why can't I do both? Because they don't leave enough space to actually explain why this question is important and what you can glean from it, why does it matter, those kinds of things. Some of you did explanations, but then got redundant because you couldn't think or imagine what else this, asking this question can do. And this requires the question. That's why the questions are important. That's why writing an 8-word question is not enough. You got to be specific. You got to really think through what the kind of things that you really want to ask. If I were giving a 1-hour talk about the Civil War and Reconstruction and all of its contours, I would hope that you could ask a specific question about, well, I don't really, well, why did you talk about this? Well, can you tell us more about that? That kind of thing. That's what you're supposed to do. That's what this assignment really was. And instead, y'all wanted to just regurgitate unthinkingly, uncreatively, uninnovatively, just regurgitate whatever you learn, which is what I'm assuming that's what you did most of your classes anyway, which is not real thinking and really is a disservice to the entire purpose of even going to college. Why go to college if you're just going to do what you did in high school? Be perfectly honest, I don't understand that. So that's why I wanted you to do the assignment and take it seriously. But just to name a few things that people didn't really do a good job of covering, only two of you talked about the Union Navy during the war, the Confederate Navy during the war. Only a handful of you, maybe four of you, asked about innovations, technological innovations during the war. None of you ever talked about naval innovations at all. I mean, like, first armored warships come out of the U.S. during the Civil War, fully armored, made of nothing but steel, no wood, just steel and iron ore, right? None of you talked about, the only reason anybody brought up prisoner of war camps this time around is because I mentioned them in class, right? I didn't go into any detail about it because I knew some of you would take the opportunity to use it. So that's great. But Why do I gotta mention it in order for you to get it, even though you could just look up the information yourself or look at, the lecture notes for examples in place? Only a couple of you talked about the justifications that people who are pro-slavery had, not just toward abolitionists, although that was their main purpose during the last 30 years going toward the Civil War, but in general, there have always been justifications for slavery that involve making black folks seem as if they were not really human. Those kinds of things, right? There was some of that, but not nearly enough of it. But there are all kinds of other things you could have covered, right? You could have talked about, what was it like to be in a hospital doing field work? I mean, I talked about some of it, but I didn't talk about all of it, right? Doing, the field hospital, what's life like? If you did survive your injuries and wounds and so on and so forth, you could have asked a question like that. There are a lot of things that could have been asked that didn't get asked. You could have asked, what was Texas's role in the Civil War? As a Confederate state. No one asked that question really. I mean, I didn't cover it as an example, right? What was life like? Under Union occupation during the Civil War, like in places like Memphis and Knoxville, Nashville, and Vicksburg and New Orleans and other places. No one asked that question. Um, I could keep going. I mean, that's like six questions off the top of my head, and I didn't even do. And yeah, you could say, well, you're an expert. No, I'm not actually an expert in Civil War and Reconstruction. I'm just someone who, I have more expertise than you do, but I'm not the expert right on this, right? So if I'm able to do it, you should be able to do two, right? If I'm able to do six, you should be able to do two as an individual, four as a group of three or four people. Between the four of you, you can come up at least with one apiece, right? And some of you, about 40% of you couldn't do that, couldn't meet the threshold. So there's that. Again, I'll talk about this more in class on Tuesday. I just want to give you a sense of where things are. I'm mostly pleased, to be honest with you, to the point where I didn't even have to do a curve, which is great, right? But on the other hand, there's that big gnawing middle of things where you think people should have been able to do more and they weren't. So anyway, what you have coming up now, that's worth basically doing the math here. I think a third of your grade, 35% of your grade for the remainder semester, is your Freestyle Artifact project. Freestyle Artifact project involves the Civil War and Reconstruction. Now, this is not the first time I've given this assignment. For those of you who've taken me before, and there are about at least 7 of you between the two sections who've had me before, you already know what this assignment entails. It basically means that you're doing some sort of presentation, some sort of pre-recorded presentation, video, multimedia, web-based, whatever presentation that allows you to talk about an artifact, right? An artifact that's either from the time period in question of the build up toward the Civil War, so roughly 1850 through about the mid 1880s, when it's pretty clear that Reconstruction's over. And how it reflects on the time period, its significance in real time to the time period in question, and its legacy over time, right? So it's really an opportunity to use an artifact, a physical or material artifact, to dig more deeply into a particular issue. And it could be anything, right? It can be what the US dollar looked like the greenback. In 1863, and its significance. It could be something like that, something simple as that. Mind you, that's the kind of thing that, even though I've just shared it, I haven't really thought about it. You could use it if you want. It's not something you're prohibited from using, so go ahead. You can also talk about an artifact as something that's actually contemporary, to something that exists, say, in 2023, but it harkens back to that past, right? You know, any number of things could do that, including, one of you mentioned statues, for example. You could do a statue, or what happened with a statue, why this got created, and it can delve into all kinds of things through that. Again, not prohibited, from doing those kinds of things. But it has to relate to the Civil War and Reconstruction. That's the key variable here. Can't relate to any old thing, right? All Along the Watchtower, which is a song written by Bob Dylan, but is made famous in terms of airplay by Jimi Hendrix, might have something to do with mass incarceration in the U.S., might have something to do with racism and mass incarceration in the U.S., might have something to even do with Vietnam in the U.S. But I don't think either Bob Dylan or Jimi Hendrix were thinking about the Civil War with regard to that song, so you probably can't use it, right? But it can't. But you can use music. You can be music that either harkens back to the Civil War and Reconstruction on some level, or is from the period, either or, right? It can be a photograph. It can be a, a cannon shell that's dented up and a couple of ball bearings spilled out somewhere. It can be, it's at a museum. It can be a museum, actually, if the museum deals with Civil War and Reconstruction, as long as you talk about its significance and its legacy over time, its significance in real time, and then its legacy over time. As long as you're able to do that, that's fine, right? I don't want you just picking Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Matter of fact, I'm probably not going to accept any proposal that deals with Uncle Tom's Cabin for this reason. It's low hanging fruit. You're going to think it's the easiest thing in the world to do. Just do a book review of Uncle Tom's Cabin and call it a day. No, 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 no. It's a cop out. It's an easy way out. It doesn't require a lot of thinking, and it doesn't require you to really delve that deeply. And if you were to do something like that, in all likelihood, your highest grade would probably be a B minus, because you're not really thinking any more deeply about it than, oh, this book had significance at the time. But if you start talking to me about a newspaper, you talk to me about a newsletter, you talk to me about a magazine that's from the time period in question and how it might have been created from, whatever movement was going on at the time, then fine, pick that, right? As long as it has significance in real time, meaning the time period that we're talking about, Civil War and Reconstruction, and it has a legacy that goes beyond that, right? So that's what we're looking for in doing this work. Nothing more, nothing less. I will put up more regarding samples of how to do proposals, which are due at the end of this week by this Sunday. So particularly if you want to do a group project, your group can't be bigger than 4. If you want to do a group project, by all means, the sooner you start figuring out what your group is, the better. You are figuring that out. I'm not figuring that out for you. And then put together a 1 to 2 page proposal about what your artifact's going to be, how you're going to talk about, how you're going to delve more deeply into the discussion of some aspect of the Civil War Reconstruction process, what you think the significance of this artifact is and what it relates to in terms of significance in real time, and what its legacy is beyond the time period of the Civil War and Reconstruction. As long as you do those things, that's fine. You can't just let's talk about slavery. No, no, no. I mean, you can talk about slavery, but it's got to be specific. It can't just be, what was life like for for the enslaved, or life like for black people who were enslaved and all that other stuff. No, no. You've got to be very, very specific about it. It can't just be, let's do slavery because you think it's low hanging fruit and you think it's easy. Sorry. So I want the parameters to be specific because I want you to get something out of it. And I want to get something more out of it than being bored to tears reading it. Okay? So that's pretty much it. Again, I'll talk about this more in class on Tuesday and Thursday, and I'll put up some material that hopefully will help you sort of get a sense of what it is that you're going to do.